This video chapter lesson reviews Part 8 of the N400 application. If you have a copy of your original N400, please have it with you during this lesson to follow along. Remember, during your interview, the interviewing officer has a copy of the exact application you sent the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service. If you don't have a copy of the N400, be sure to download a copy from our website. Part 8 of the N400 includes information about your marital history. We will be looking at the different ways the same questions can be asked or expressed. You will have to make sure you can spell correctly information asked about your current or previous spouses. We will help you understand each question and vocabulary. Remember to answer all questions fully and accurately. The word spouse means husband or wife. If you are speaking to a man and asked information about his spouse, you are talking about his wife. If you are speaking to a woman and asked information about her spouse, you are talking about her husband. In this part of the N400, you will have to memorize different dates, numbers, and names. Let's get familiar with the following words. Current spouse, died, divorced, ever, immigration status, marital history, previous marriage, prior. One of the first questions about your marital history is the number of times you have been married. You must include annulled marriages. If you were married to the same spouse more than one time, count each time as a separate marriage. In Part 8, Section A, you will be asked questions about the number of times you have been married. Here are some of the possible questions that can be asked of you about the times you have been married. How many times have you been married? What is the total number of times you have been married? How many spouses have you had? Have you ever been married before? You will have to provide information about your current spouse. Remember, the word spouse just means husband or wife. Here are questions in Part 8, Section B, about your current spouse. What is your spouse's last name? What is your spouse's first name? Does your spouse have a middle name? What is your spouse's middle name? Spell your spouse's last name. Spell your spouse's first name. Spell your spouse's middle name. What is the date of birth of your spouse? When was your spouse born? What is the date of your marriage? When were you married? What is your spouse's social security number? What is your spouse's home address? What city does your spouse live in? What state does your spouse live in? What is your spouse's zip code? You have a spouse now, is that right? You will need to know if your spouse is a U.S. citizen. If your spouse is a citizen through naturalization, you must know the date and place of the naturalization. If your spouse regained a U.S. citizenship, you must also know the date and place the citizenship was regained. Here are some of the possible questions that can be asked of you from Part 8, Section C and D of the N400 about whether your current spouse is a U.S. citizen. Is your spouse a United States citizen? Your spouse is a U.S. citizen. Is that right? Is your wife a U.S. citizen? Is your husband a U.S. citizen? If your spouse is a United States citizen, when did he become a United States citizen? If your spouse is a United States citizen, where did they become a citizen? When did your spouse become a U.S. citizen? Where did your spouse become a U.S. citizen? What city and state did your spouse become a U.S. citizen? In Part 8, Section E, you must know the immigration status of your spouse. If they are not citizens, then most likely they are legal permanent residents. If your spouse is an illegal, please do not use the word illegal. Instead, when asked the immigration status of your spouse, say they are undocumented if they enter the U.S. illegally. Here are some of the possible questions that can be asked of you from Part 8 about the immigration status of your spouse. What is the immigration status of your spouse? What is your spouse's country of citizenship? Where was your spouse born? What is your spouse's resident or USCIS A number? Is your spouse illegal? Did your spouse enter the U.S. illegally? Sometimes the word prior spouse is used instead of former spouse. If you were married before, you will have to give information about your former spouse or spouses. All the information you need to know about your current spouse, you will also need to know about your prior spouse. The questions for this section are only for people who were married before. Here are some of the possible questions that can be asked of you from Part 8, Section F and G about your former spouse. If you were married before, what is your prior spouse's last name? How many times was your prior spouse married? Spell your prior spouse's last name. Spell your prior spouse's first name. What is your prior spouse's immigration status? What is the date of marriage to your prior spouse? When did you become married to your former spouse? What is the date your marriage ended with your former spouse? How did your prior marriage end? Have you ever been divorced? Have you ever been widowed? In the last section of Part 8, you will need to memorize facts about your current spouse's marital history. All the questions here are about the person you are married to now. You will need to know information about your current spouse's marital history. How many times has your current spouse been married? If your current spouse has ever been married before, what is their prior spouse's last name? If your current spouse has ever been married before, what is their prior spouse's first name? If your current spouse has ever been married before, what is their prior spouse's immigration status? If your current spouse has ever been married before, what was the date of their marriage? If your current spouse has ever been married before, what is the date that the marriage ended? If your current spouse has ever been married before, how did that marriage end? The following are questions for a woman with a husband or former husband. What's your husband's name? What's his date of birth? Was he born in the U.S.? Does he live with you? Where does he live? What is his immigration status? Is he a U.S. citizen? Is he a permanent resident? When did he become a citizen? Where did he become a citizen? How many times has he been married? Has he ever been married before this? Has he had any previous marriages? Does he have a former wife? Do you have any former husbands? Do you have any prior husbands? The following are questions for a man with a wife or former wife. What's your wife's name? What's her date of birth? Was she born in the U.S.? Does she live with you? Where does she live? What is her immigration status? Is she a U.S. citizen? Is she a permanent resident? When did she become a citizen? Where did she become a citizen? How many times has she been married? Has she ever been married before this? Has she had any previous marriages? Does she have a former husband? Do you have any former wives? Do you have any prior wives? To test what you just learned in this video chapter lesson, be sure to watch our practice interview videos.